Hello and welcome to Now in Zen. It's Algorithmic August, and to kick off this episode, we've got Matthew Skueue. Hello,
Oh,
Mr. Skueue. How are you?
I'm good. I just mentioned before, but I'll say this for the people listening. So, I live in quite a. So I've never been to university or done any music studies, so I don't actually know any people to talk to about microtonal music stuff. So I'm excited for this because it's a good chance for me to speak to someone who actually knows what I'm talking about for a change. And I guess to the people listening, it's probably the same thing. A lot of them probably don't have people to listen to, so they can listen to us and have the conversations that way.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very excited about this conversation too because I know that it seems like from the descriptions that you've provided with your Bandcamp albums on the pages, you use a lot of algorithmic processes to generate your music, and there's a lot of interesting things you could say about that, like how such a thing would be built and what kind of music you are going to end up with, and whether that's the path that you have decided you want to take. I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, what made you decide that you wanted to do algorithmic music and not write it yourself?
So my history as a musician, I've been writing music for a really, really, really long time. So I started off writing tracker music, so using like DOS sequences. And then there was a period where there was like this PlayStation game called Music 2000. And it had
Hmm.
like these like pre-done clips, but you could kind of write some stuff yourself. And then eventually I got into breakcore music, and because I was using trackers, that was already a really good system for it. Then later I moved to traditional DAWs. Then I joined a band and did guitar stuff. I was in a math metal band and played about 30 gigs with them. And also the Melbourne music scene has a really good live improvisation thing going on, because there's a local event called the Make It Up Club, and they've been running for, I don't know exactly, but I think it's like 10, 15 years. And so like every week they'll just get artists that just go there and they just make up stuff on the spot. So I've had mostly a composition background, but also because of the local community, lots of live improvisation stuff. So that's my history. In terms of the what I call the music generator, because I haven't given it a name yet, because it's just such a big project. It seems like I've got to give it a really good name, and I'll never name it because no name will be good enough for it. But but basically, what it came to. So I was learning to play guitar, and I had this ambition that I would become an instrumentalist so that I could improvise. But my interest in music is more in electronic music, and there's nothing you can do with six strings that makes techno come out of it. It's not a thing. And I've also been really interested in microtonal music since forever. And that started out with there's an animated film called Akira, and the group that did the soundtrack for that, they were sort of like a large ensemble folk group that did a lot of gamelan music. So just based on, because the gamelan is, I think how it works is the tuning is tuned to the individual bells, and so the scales are way different than what you would get tuning to the harmonics of a string or a tube. And so it's just really interesting. And then they found some electronic instruments where they could change the tuning files so that they could get all of their electronic instruments to match it. And so I watched this amazing animated movie that had all of this weird music, and I just became obsessed with that soundtrack. And this was before I knew what microtonal music was. It was just giving me an ear for this sound. I also listened to a lot of Aphex Twin and Audica, the electronic musicians, and they never advertised it, but they were doing a lot of microtonal stuff. So my ear was getting used to that as well. And occasionally I'd try to play a cover of some of their music, and I just noticed that the notes were missing. They weren't there, or I thought things are out of tune. And it was just fascinating to me. So that's how my interest in microtonal music came about. And then with the music generator, because I had this ambition to be an instrumentalist, I realized that it would take me like decades to get to the point where I could think of a musical idea and play it. And there wasn't really any instrument that could do what I wanted, because I wanted to write full songs. And a guitar, like, that's just the instrument I had nearby. It's the only thing I had access to.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't. I wanted to make electronic music. You can't make electronic music. So I just realized I had to write my own software from scratch. What's really happening behind the scene is I've got hundreds of keyboard shortcuts, and every 4 bars, I basically tell the computer what to play for the next 4 bars. It's generative, but it's all based on my own language about music theory, and to sort of build the conceptual framework. And then just before the next 4 bars comes up, I just press all of the changes I want to make, the way that I want to change from this thing to the next thing. And then it does it. And it'll spit out something that's not exactly what I would write if I was writing it note for note, but it's still the idea that I had. And so that's the way that I can sort of navigate almost in real time, what I want the next bit of the music to be. That's in Pure Data. It's similar to Max MSP. Max MSP is like the slick commercial version of Pure Data, is what I like to think of it as.
Yeah.
But Pure Data is just, it's easier to use. Like I migrate across many different systems, and I can't really deal with licensing. So it's not as good as Max MSP, but because it's totally open source, I can kind of get into the workings of it and fiddle around and get it to do what I want.
I tried Pure Data once when I was a college student, but I use Max MSP generally for that sort of purpose.
It's much better performance. You can save stuff. You've got to build your own saving system in Pure Data. It's really janky.
So the system that you're creating, it sounds like it's something where, is there sort of a feedback loop occurring in the writing process? Like you've created a music generator that will give you microtonal music, and every 4 bars, it's like you're listening to 4 bars, and then you have the computer write 4 bars, listen to that 4 bars, and then continue onward. Is that sort of like the methodology, the main methodology? Does the methodology change? Like what's going on with the process, the writing process?
Well, so it's probably, if I explain the writing process, it'll explain a lot about how it all works. So there's been many different versions of this, because I've been making it and remaking it for, like, at this point, like the past decade. But at the height of its quickness, which was the last version, I was able to write songs in 20 minutes. So I'd spend 5 minutes making instruments, 5 minutes making patterns, 5 minutes rehearsing, and then 5 minutes recording. And that was my daily routine. And that's all the songs on Anagnorisis, the previous album to the most current one I've released. All of those were done in under 20 minutes. So that's the process. So I'm not coming up with everything on the fly, but what I'm doing is so I come at it with an idea, and I make the instruments that suit the idea that I want. So it might be like, I might be wanting to make some very busy dance music, or I might want to make some more instrumental hip hop, or I might want to make something that has no beats and is all melody instruments. So with that in mind, I make the instruments. Then I randomly generate a bunch of patterns until it sounds roughly like what I want it to be. And then I go through each individual channel and each individual pattern and just keep generating new ones until it sounds like roughly what I was wanting to get. And then once I've created everything, I've got this thing that's kind of like, if you imagine I've got like a palette in front of me, and I always put everything in kind of the same spot so that I can use my, so I can intuitively move between things. And so because I categorize everything and I sort of standardize where everything's going to move, I'm able to, once I've created all these things, I just basically move through it. So people that are familiar with Ableton Live, there's a thing in that called a clip launcher where you sort of have your pre-made clips and you move between them. That's essentially what I'm doing when I'm playing live. So I've already made all the patterns and kind of pre-vetted them, made sure that they're all good, they work together. When I do the practice run, I figure, like, can I modulate between this key and that phrase, or does it sound like way off? Like, does it just sound awful? And then I can write a bunch of notes and sort of come up with like a really vague musical score it's just like a path I want to take it. And then I can play it. So yeah, that's that's the songwriting process. All of this stuff is very technical, and I make music and I make software, but at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is be able to describe music and make music by describing it.
Yeah, that's a
So
really profound statement. It seems
yeah,
like with algorithmic music, do you feel like the patterns that the algorithmic music maker gives you are ever too formulaic for you? Like, do you ever find yourself wanting to break away from that process, or do you find that it's giving you everything you ever really wanted as a writer?
it's complicated. So I listen to a lot of music that's nothing like the music that I make. And so an interesting thing about my system is it's really easy to do complicated things, but if I want to dial it back to like sort of lo-fi instrumental hip hop sort of sounds, then I really got to put in some work, because that stuff kind of lives and dies on composer input. Whereas things that sound a bit more like free jazz, where you're used to hearing a lot of notes coming out at the same time, that stuff's much easier to write, because it's kind of it's its forte. It's like it can already play in time a lot better than I ever could, and it can follow all the chord changes much better than I ever could. With instrumental hip hop, it's like every single note's really important, because you're creating this like really slow, deliberate narrative. Whereas when the notes are going past 100 mile an hour, then you can kind of get away with a few kludgy notes, because you're already painting a vivid enough picture that you can get away with the odd flub. One of my goals in future is to do a lot more overdubs. So if I hear that the bass line isn't quite working, I can just write the bass line, and I can get the bass line to be exactly what I sounded like. So because with the system that I create, it spits out a how many tracks is it? I think it's like 24 stereo tracks of all the different instruments. And so I've got a template, so I can just throw it into my DAW, and it'll kind of automatically master everything for me, because all the instruments are always in the same slot. But what I want to do is to be able to play alongside. So only recently I've realized that you can make your own VSTs and import them as pure data objects. So that's my next step is to basically set it up so that I can do overdubs and add a little bit of the what I like to call the voice. Like if there was something that you were singing, it would be that instrument, because I feel like that's the thing where generative music is not so good at writing it. But as a human, you can come up with it on the fly and it'll sound great, because all you're doing is responding to the music and playing like the right melody for that bit of music, which I feel like comes very naturally to humans, and I've got no idea how to get a computer to do that.
Yeah, it does seem like that is definitely a natural aspect of improvisation. And like with my students, when they're learning to improvise, I try and get them to imagine a melody and then play along with that melody. It's very difficult to define using mathematical rules how we just come up with melodies that sound right in the moment.
I think the technical term for that is audiation, where you hear
Yes.
the melody in your head and then you can sort of play it. So
Yeah.
Whenever I'm listening to anyone's music, I'm always coming up with my own melodies over the top. So it's a bit of it's like something I've wanted to do for a long time, and that's the next step. But it's such a huge project. There's like a timeline of things to do, and that's like currently what I'm working on is I've built my own sampler, because I've mostly been doing all of my instruments have been generated from like sine waves and wavetables and things like that. But I want to move into sampling, because that means that I can play more natural sounding instruments, and that's the next step in where I want to take my music, is sort of away from all the bleepy bloopy wavetables, which I love, but I just want to inject a little bit of natural stuff in there.
Like I can tell from the descriptions you give on the Bandcamp page that you've been working on this for such a long time. Do you think you'll ever stop working on it as an algorithmic device, or do you think you'll get it to where you want it someday?
So I've had it where I've wanted it in the past, but so all of the music that was written on Anagnorisis that only took 20 minutes to write, that was great, but it wasn't very general purpose. It was like really good at doing one thing and one thing only.
Mm-hmm.
The rewrite that I've only just finished in like the last couple of months, and sort of have been able to write music again, The idea behind that is that I can, if I listen to any music that I like the sound of that has totally different rules to what I'm doing, I can now write a little module that will enable me to write music in that style. And so to me, like in the previous incarnations, I've always had this rule that you always have to have a working prototype so you can always write music. Never have it so that it's kind of like, if you're fixing a car, if it's in the shop, you can't drive it, is the idea. But the downside to that is that a lot of the solutions that I came to problems were like these little like Jimmy fixes that worked. It's kind of like if you're going on a road trip and you just got to keep the car working, you might duct tape a few things together. And so over the last 2 years, I've done a rewrite where I was like, all right, how can I set it up so that no matter what idea I get, I can put it into it? And that's done. So I don't need to rewrite the system anymore. All I'm going to do is like little additions and little extra modules because now it's all totally modular. And so there was 2 years where I couldn't really write music because I made all these really good improvements to the system. And every time I'd go back to an old version of the system, there'd just be these buttons I wanted to press that weren't there that I'd implemented in the new version, but they weren't in the old version. So I was just like, I just need to focus on finishing it. And I've done that recently. So I expect to be able to go back to making a song every day, but I've only just moved house and I had there was a bunch of stuff that happened over COVID and I was living out of a friend's shed. So I wasn't really able to do any music. And the EP that I released, I don't think it's my best music by far, but I felt like it was a good little snapshot of this time when I really wanted to write music and I couldn't get more than a day or two, of time to do anything. And so I feel like some of that came out into the music because there was like this urgency to just get it done and get it out. But at the same time, it's using the new system. So it's like, to me, it's novel work.
I know that making music is this ritual practice for you then, using the system. Is there a lot of music that is sort of tucked away on your computer that hasn't been released yet?
So with Anagnorisis, I made like 90 tracks and released like 7 or 8.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So yeah. So, but a lot of them are bad. Like, I really like being able to write bad music. Like, it's so easy for me to fall into the trap of being perfectionist, and that's part of my daily routine. Is it enables me to, like, I can sort of, if I want to make a track that's like so sour sounding that like no one else but me would want to listen to it, I can just do it. And then I can just put it on the archives and no one ever has to listen to it. There was a period where I had a Bandcamp that was just called Daily Skueue, where I was releasing everything.
Interesting.
But it was just too much overhead. Like the whole point of this thing was to eliminate the friction between writing and adding, like, I'd spend more time uploading this than I would spend writing the song, and that just seemed like a ridiculous premise. I think I loaded all my music into Winamp at one point, and I realized that there was like at least a full week worth of music nonstop. Quite often what happens is if a song's really good, like I know it, and then I'll put a lot more effort into it. But if I'm having a bad day, or just it's not, the generator's not giving me anything, or my ideas are not focused enough that I'm telling it what to make accurately, then it can be awful. So there's a lot of give and take.
I'm deadly curious as well about the microtonal systems you use for writing microtonal music and what you think of intervals in general.
I'm excited about this aspect because I haven't been able to talk to anyone about it. So so I don't have any formal training in music. Like it's for me, it's all intuitive. I just started writing music and wrote music by ear for many years. Then the internet got really good at putting out like these little short explainer videos that would explain the concepts of music, but wouldn't go into any of the sort of detail that you would get in a book about the topic. And so basically what I found is there's this thing called functional harmony, which anyone who's into music theory knows what it is. And my understanding of it is that it was meant to the original intention was to describe music written mostly in the major scale and a few derivatives, but it kind of became the de facto explanation method for all chord theories because pretty much it was the only language that anyone had that actually explained anything, and so everyone latched onto it. So in history, my understanding is that it was this really specific thing about like, here's this particular cadence and this particular scale, and here's how it works. You know, look at us naming this and figuring it out. Well done. And then everyone else was like, oh, this terminology is really useful. I'm going to use it to explain literally everything. And so you get these strange things like people will talk about non-functional harmony, which usually is just when instead of playing in a scale, you're kind of moving between two chords, but it's far enough from the scale structure that they call it non-functional harmony. But really, it's just different functional harmony. It's not non-functional. It's just got a different function.
Absolutely. I wish people would try to diagnose more functional harmonies than those of the diatonic scale, but I think it's also tricky to come up with theories that would explain it in the same way, because so much of that is built on what's happened in the past and observations of that. So you can't just like come up with a new common practice theory of a Blackwood 10 scale like out of nowhere, because there's no common practice.
Well, I would say that you can. I'll explain this. So if you're using an equal division of the octave scale, so like let's say 23 EDO, right?
That's a good one.
So all of the notes, like there's no analogy for the notes, right? But chances are you're not going to, unless you're going to do all these little chromatic runs, which I know all you microtoner people love to do. I hear you. You're doing it all the time.
I feel seen.
Everyone does it.
Oh yeah.
But like, yeah, so everyone does all these like chromatic runs and stuff because, you know, it's exciting. You haven't been able to do that before. But in the end, usually you end up playing these little scales within the sets. And so with my microtonal music generator, I sort of realized that I have to set some limitations. Like every time I write a module in my system, I go on this month-long deep dive where I learn all about the theory, put it all into the computer, discard all the useless parts, and come up with names for things. And so then I set up my system so that all I can do is press the button that has the name for the thing. In the case of like scale choice, for example, pretty much what I do is I have like a button for it. There's like a selector, but let's just say, for example's sake, so I've got a button that's just like, I want an EDO scale, a ratio scale, or an algorithmic scale. And I'll describe what those are. So equal divisions of the octave is just, everyone knows that sort of what that is. And to me, the intuitive understanding I get of equal divisions of the octave scales are that you can do key changes and they're really seamless because the spacing's the same. You know, it's you get this certain effect with an EDO scale. And then the other part of the EDO scale is because all of the step sizes are the same, your ear quickly picks up that there's a common value between the notes. And so your ear very quickly learns like, okay, there's a predictable distance between the notes. You know, you can change keys and it's totally seamless. So that's what EDO scales are good at. Then you've got ratio scales where there's usually one particular note where everything lines up beautifully because there, you know, if you're doing it right, if you're using it to its advantage, you know, you've got all of these ratios that maybe aren't the regular ratios, but they're ratios that make sense within the context of that scale. Mm-hmm. And so if I want to write really lush, you know, very dense chordal music that maybe sticks in one scale, that's where I want to go because that's where all the interesting stuff's going to happen. And then, and with ratios, I think of ratios as like the dividing scales because it's all division. But then if you think of scales like the Irv Wilson scales where he's basically got a mathematical operation that he runs, and then it just creates like endless amazing scales. Yeah. But in some of he does a lot of stuff with ratios, but in some of them, if you were to write them out as ratios, they would just be nonsense, right? But despite that, they all work. And so I think of those as like multiplication scales. And so in my mind, there's basically division scales, ratios, multiplication scales, which is algorithmic, and then EDO, which I just think of those as like being equal. So it's just like equal steps. And so it's really interesting because I've got this system where I can just press a button and immediately go to it. It's really good for ear training because I can immediately hear what the result is. And so I don't need to go to the process of like playing, relearning another scale and playing all the different notes of the new scale. Even if I'm using an EDO scale that has way more than 12 notes, I still hand pick a scale that has 12 notes in it that will work. And then from then I usually reduce to a 7-note scale. But I try to pick one where I can use all the previous terminology, all the previous lexicon, write with it. And as long as I know, okay, I'm not writing in equal tone, I'm writing in this scale that has this effect with these intervals, I can still intuitively think in terms of functional harmony, but the music that comes out is nothing like it. It's like a way to piggyback all of this pre-learned music theory onto something where it usually wouldn't fit. And so that's how I'm able to make quick decisions because, I've spent years learning about functional harmony and I've got all of that available to me now. And it doesn't matter that there's no perfect fifth in this scale. So technically it's not working. I can just play with it, hear what it sounds like, and then I can be like, all right, cadences don't work in this. So I'm going to do, instead of doing like a fifth cadence, I'm going to do a leading tone type cadence. And then I'll see if that works. And if that works, I'm like, okay, good. I'll set up all of the different patterns and notes so that it never tries to do a fifth cadence. And then I've solved the problem. Because with a lot of music theory, a lot of the times people aren't using just one master theory. They're using a bunch of things. You've got functional harmony, but that doesn't invalidate intervals and their effect. And then with like pop music, it's like often they're not thinking about functional harmony at all. They're just thinking about what's the distance between this chord and that chord and how much energy does it give when it moves between this chord. So in pop music, you get these really weird chord progressions which don't work in functional harmony. But if you think of the chords as intervals, suddenly it all makes sense.
The notion that you're presenting where you use the tenets of functional harmony, but you fit a Xen harmonic scale into it with about 7 notes. It reminds me of Michael Bruschi's dissertation where he describes functions of certain scale degrees, but the scale degrees don't necessarily have to line up with a particular pattern that's like the diatonic scale or something like that. So I think there's a lot of ground to really be explored there. When I said that like there couldn't really be a common practice theory for a scale, I didn't mean that you couldn't fit the notes into like a functional harmony sleeve. I was more saying you can't describe a large body of work and how people use the chord progressions in that yet. I mean, like I just don't feel like there's enough data.
Yeah, definitely. And it's the lack of that language that's the reason why I've sort of I've made this compromise of just completely subverting all of these other terms. Like something that I've always had an issue with is there's lots of words to describe a lot of sound things in terms of timbre and like tempos, but they're all like these old like Italian words.
Right,
And so they kind of mean nothing to me. Like it's almost like I've got to memorize this new language, and I'd prefer to work quicker. So I'm really happy to just use things wrong. Like when you think about like the regular spoken language, it's like people reinterpret what a thing means all the time. And it's important to have consensus when you're talking to other people because they won't understand you if you use the term wrong. Yeah. But if I'm only talking to myself, then I can just go wild and use whatever I want. And I'm quite a big fan of that. There's this thing that I use ratio scales for that I barely hear anyone else do. And I want to hear more of it. So I'm hoping someone listens and steals this idea. But so when you're using a ratio scale, the root note is always the really harmonic note that everything kind of I described as like all the notes fold down to the root note because they're all ratios of that root note.
Right.
And that's great if you want to write these like really nice notes and things. But something that I found is you can do this trick where if you make the home note not the root note, your brain still knows that there's this note that you're not playing that is definitely the home chord, because all of the harmonics are folding down to this note that you're never playing.
Yeah.
And so you can do this thing where you can make a ratio scale and then play it like, a virtual semitone, and I'm using quotation marks, but you can't see me. You can use a virtual semitone above it. Make sure you never play the real root note, and the whole time your brain is like, this works, but there's something missing. There's something that's not there, and you can write all this really complicated music. But then if you then modulate down to the key that does have the root note at the end, the resolution you get is so much greater than anything else you can do. And there was a song that I wrote that it was the end of Anagnorisis, and I kind of played with this. It's a song called Equivalence. Half the song is playing where I've kept the root note the same, but I'm moving all of the frequencies so that half of it is played with the root note being this like ghost note that's never being played, and the rest of it's being like the root note is there, and so it sounds really settled. And so I'm playing basically exactly the same phrase, but I'm just switching the frequencies ever so slightly so that one of them has a perfect resolution and the other one is like off by a whole step. And so it just has this like eerie feeling where, you can sort of create this like extra tension, and you can create this like ghost note in the brain. And it's all because your brain is so good at funneling those frequencies down to what the root note is, that you can create these beautiful senses of tension and release by specifically not playing that. Which, if you think about like, why would you play a ratio scale? It's to have that sense of thing. But by subverting it in this way, you get these beautiful results.
Can you describe specific points in Equivalence where you're playing on a particular chord that doesn't have that root and then one that does have the root? I want to see if I can hear it.
So there's something that sounds like a key change, like I think like 20 or something seconds in. I feel like it should be really obvious, but maybe I know exactly what I'm listening for.
Hey, cool. Let me see if I recognize it as a key change. So you're saying that you had the root of the chord in the first section, right? And then you took the root away. That's what I was sensing.
Yeah. And so all like it's playing things that are very close to like a very just intonation-y type chords.
Right.
But all of the notes are off on just enough that your brain hears the missing fundamental and knows that there's something wrong, even though everything about the scale, because I think that I tried to make it sound very majory so that it would have the most sense of there should be a resolution at the root.
Yeah.
And I'm pounding the root on the kick drum, like the kick drum's playing nothing but the root note. But you still know that there's something off, even with all of the niceness of the sound. There's still something missing. And then when it moves into the next part, which I think does actually move up or down a few steps, I think I couldn't quite get it to be exact. Yeah, suddenly it just sounds so much more harmonic because you've got that root note that everything's folding down to. And so the entire, like, there's like a bit where it sort of trails off at the end and fades out. Like all of that was back to where the root note is audible again.
What kind of ratio scale are you using in Equivalence, or what kind of just scales do you like to use? Do you generally stick within 5 and 7 limit, or do you branch out?
The real answer is that unless I take a note, I don't know. Because
Huh.
you know how I was mentioning before that I basically, what I do is I do all of the theory and then I put them into these big categorizations, and then I just have a button that sort of presses it. So I have a button that just says I want to adjust intonation scale.
Right.
And so if I just want to be surprised, that's what I'll do. But I also have a list, and basically in this list, I've just got like all of the different ratios written down, and I've got a color coding system so that I can see if any of the ratios happen to line up with the just intonation scale. Because usually I'm trying to see like how far away from just intonation do I want to be? Like that's one of the things. And there's a few ratios that I know have a particular sound. And so what I'll do is I'll just look at the list, and just at a glance, I'll be like, all right, how far away from just do I want this to be? The way that the system that I wrote translates note data into microtonal things is just by using a ratio. So it'll be between 1 to 2.
Yeah.
And so everything I write has to be octave repeating scales. I'm not going to do any scales that don't repeat at the octave, because the sound design that I choose to use is going to make that the case anyway. That's a compromise. I might occasionally do a few tracks in the future that, you know, where I've sort of set up the sound design so it doesn't have that problem. But right now I'm just looking at quantity more so than doing these bespoke little experiments.
When you select an equal temperament, do you also select your subset notes you're using for a 7-note scale? Do you pick that, like you pick that by hand, or does your button say give me a 7-note scale? And how does that work?
So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So when I mentioned before that I reduced to a 12-note scale first, so there's a lot of key changes in my music. I've got a few banks of things that I can press on my system. And so there's 3 buttons on my keyboard that all they do is they change the key. So that's what the root note is. And then I've got another set of keys, and what they do is they do modal modulation. So starting from the 12 notes is important because I'm always changing modes. So I'll always simplify down to 7 notes, but I'll be changing what those 7 notes are constantly. And so what that enables me to do is I can use EDO scales that have a large number of notes in them. And I don't have to be restricted to 7 notes. I can kind of slowly wander through all 12 of the notes that I've got in this sort of simplified scale. And so I'm less choosing which 7 notes to play, and I'm choosing which 12-note palette do I want to use in this particular scale. And so with a lot of the EDO scales, I developed this system so that I can, because EDO has so much repetition because all the notes are sort of scaled apart, I can do this thing where I can figure out, I can look at like, what are all the possible permutations of which notes do I choose and leave out? And how many of them are multiples of each other? How many of them are copies? And then I can simplify that down to a much fewer number of different scales. Then I can pick them based on, I know that I've got this EDO scale, I've got this kind of spacing. And so I can now move between those